My species conquered star systems by roaring louder than anyone else. Then we captured a human who never made a sound, and our screams were the first to die. You need to understand something about the Kavalesh before this story makes any sense whatsoever. We are loud. No, seriously, I mean loud. Our entire civilization, spanning 4-star systems and 12 colony worlds, is built on the fundamental principle that volume equals power. The louder you roar, the stronger you are. The more you bellow, the more respect you command. Our warriors train their vocal cords as rigorously as their muscles. Our politicians win elections based on decibel output. Our mating rituals, well, let's just say the neighbors always know when someone's getting lucky. When we go to war, which is often because we're honestly kind of aggressive as a species, the battlefield sounds like a heavy metal concert had a baby with a volcanic eruption. We announce our attacks, we scream our battle cries, we roar our victories and howl our defeats. It's tradition, it's honor, it's who we are. So when we captured the human, we thought we'd won the lottery. She was small, barely reaching the chest plate of our shortest warrior. Her skin was this odd peachy brown color that looked far too soft for combat. No claws, no fangs, no natural armor plating whatsoever. Her people had sent her as a diplomatic envoy to negotiate some trade agreement nonsense that High Command didn't actually care about. We'd decided in our infinite wisdom that capturing a human representative would be excellent leverage for the upcoming territorial disputes in the Andara sector. Commander Throck, bless his oversized ego, was practically vibrating with excitement when they brought her aboard the warship Crushing Thunder. He'd been the one to authorize the ambush, and he fully expected to be promoted for his brilliant tactical thinking. The human came aboard in restraints flanked by 6 of our best guards. They were all roaring triumphantly, as is proper. She said nothing, didn't even look particularly concerned, which we found hilarious at the time. I was there in my capacity as communications officer and unofficial record keeper. My name is Vex, and I've been with the Kavalesh Imperial Fleet for 16 cycles. I've seen battles, negotiations, and more than a few executions. I thought I'd seen everything. I hadn't seen Iris Chen yet. That was her name, we learned later. Iris Chen. Human. Female. Age, 28 standard years. Diplomatic Corps. 3rd class. 5 feet and 4 inches tall, which means absolutely nothing to me but apparently is quite average for her species. She walked into our interrogation bay without making a sound. Should have been our first clue, really. The interrogation bay of the Crushing Thunder was designed to intimidate. 30 feet of vertical space, walls made of reinforced durasteel that amplified every sound, and lighting that could be adjusted from blinding brightness to pitch darkness at the flip of a switch. The chair in the center where prisoners sat was bolted directly to the floor and surrounded by a circle of speakers that could produce sound waves intense enough to rupture eardrums. Iris Chen sat down in that chair like she was settling into a coffee shop booth. No struggle, no protest, no fear scent which our olfactory sensors would have definitely picked up. She just sat there, hands still bound in front of her, and looked at absolutely nothing in particular with these dark brown eyes that seemed almost bored. Throck circled her like a predator, which is exactly what he was going for. He stood 7 feet tall, covered in the traditional battle scars that marked him as a veteran of 32 campaigns. His chest plates gleamed under the harsh lights, each one engraved with a victory he'd roared into existence. "Do you know where you are, human?" he bellowed, his voice hitting probably 120 decibels easy. Iris blinked once, said nothing. The guards around the perimeter laughed, which sounds like rocks being tumbled in a metal drum when Kavalesh do it. One of them, a younger warrior named Drax, who was always trying too hard, stepped forward and slammed his fist against his chest plate. The clang echoed through the chamber. "The commander asked you a question." "Soft skin," Drax roared, spraying saliva everywhere in his enthusiasm. Iris turned her head exactly 3 degrees in his direction, still said nothing. Her expression hadn't changed even slightly. It was like watching someone wait for a bus that was running late, mildly annoying but not worth getting emotional about. This went on for approximately 5 minutes. Throck roared questions. The guards roared insults. Someone activated the speakers to add a low-frequency rumble that was supposed to induce primal terror. Standard intimidation protocol, very effective on most species. Iris Chen sat there like a statue carved from absolute indifference. "Perhaps she is deaf," suggested Krath, the security chief, helpfully bellowing this observation at maximum volume directly into Iris's face from 6 inches away. Her hair moved slightly from the force of his breath. That was the only reaction. I watched all of this from my monitoring station, recording everything as required by military protocol. I noticed something the others didn't, probably because they were too busy congratulating themselves on capturing such a pathetic specimen. Iris wasn't frozen in fear. She wasn't dissociating from trauma. Her breathing was steady, controlled, rhythmic. Her muscles, what I could see of them through her diplomatic uniform, weren't tense. She was relaxed, completely, utterly, genuinely relaxed. In a room full of warriors from a species that had conquered 6 civilizations through sheer, aggressive force, surrounded by beings that could literally tear her apart with their bare hands, this tiny human woman was as calm as a pond on a windless day. Throck seemed to realize this at the same moment I did. His roaring stopped abruptly, which made the sudden silence feel heavy and wrong. "You are not afraid," he said, and for the first time since the human had arrived he spoke at a normal volume. Well, normal for us, which is still pretty loud by most species standards. Iris Chen looked directly at him for the first time, and smiled. Not a big smile, just a small upward curve of her lips that somehow made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped 10 degrees. She still didn't say a word. Throck didn't like that smile. Nobody in that room liked that smile, though most of the guards were too pumped full of adrenaline and victory hormones to notice. I noticed things. It's literally my job. Your silence will not save you, Throck roared, back to full volume because the quiet thing had lasted all of 3 seconds and clearly made him uncomfortable. We have ways of making even the most stubborn species cooperate. He gestured dramatically to Krath, who activated a holographic display. Images flickered to life around Iris, showing previous interrogations. A Vandorian merchant who'd tried to smuggle weapons, screaming as sonic pulses rattled his brain. A Quellan spy, all 6 of her arms broken and twisted at unnatural angles. A Thorian captain who'd held out for 3 days before begging to tell us everything. Standard psychological warfare. Show them what happens to people who don't cooperate. Make them understand that resistance is futile and painful and ultimately pointless. Iris watched the holographic torture parade with the same expression someone might use while watching paint dry. When a particularly graphic image of a disemboweled Krathan appeared, she actually yawned, covered her mouth with her bound hands and everything. Proper etiquette even while being threatened with evisceration. "Does nothing frighten you?" Throck demanded, and I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice underneath all that volume. Iris tilted her head slightly, like she was considering the question. Then she shook her head. Just a small movement. No, Rax couldn't take it anymore. He stormed forward, grabbing a pain inducer from the equipment rack mounted on the wall. It was a nasty piece of technology, designed to stimulate every nerve ending in a localized area simultaneously. We typically used it on extremities, fingers, toes, that sort of thing. "Perhaps you need a demonstration," he roared, activating the device. It hummed to life, energy crackling along its length. Throck didn't stop him. That should have been a red flag right there. Throck was many things, most of them involving excessive volume and questionable strategic decisions, but he usually didn't approve of torturing diplomats without at least getting some intelligence first. But Iris's silence was getting under his skin. Under all of our skins, really. Drax reached for Iris's hand. "Stop," Iris said. Her first word, spoken quietly, barely above a whisper. In the cavernous interrogation bay, with all its sound-amplifying architecture, that single soft syllable somehow carried to every corner of the room. Drax stopped. Not because she'd given an order, obviously. A prisoner doesn't give orders. He stopped because something in the way she'd said it made his combat instincts scream at him that maybe, just maybe, touching this human was a spectacularly bad idea. Throck held up one massive hand, signaling Drax to wait. "So the human can speak," he roared, sounding pleased with this development. "Finally. Now we can begin proper negotiations. You will tell us everything about your fleet positions in the Andara sector, your defensive capabilities, your supply lines, and your command structure. In return, we might let you live, might let you return to your people with all your limbs still attached." Iris looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at each guard in turn, her gaze moving methodically around the room. When her eyes passed over my monitoring station, I felt something I hadn't felt in years of military service. Prey instinct. Finally, she spoke again. Same quiet voice, like she was asking about the weather or commenting on the decor. How many soldiers do you have on this ship? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. What? Throck bellowed, because apparently he hadn't heard her, or didn't understand why that particular question mattered. How many soldiers? Iris repeated, still quiet, still calm. Do you have on this ship? Krath laughed, that rock-tumbling sound again. 342 warriors, he roared proudly. The finest in the Imperial fleet. Why do you ask, little human? Do you think your pathetic rescue team can fight through that many? The Iris smiled again. That same small smile that made the temperature drop. No, she said softly. I was just wondering if that would be enough. Nobody laughed this time. Drax, bless his overconfident heart, decided that Iris's cryptic comment was just psychological posturing from a desperate prisoner. He was young, only 23 cycles old, and he'd been part of exactly 4 combat operations, all of which had been overwhelming Kovalesh victories against significantly weaker opponents. He thought he was invincible, which is what youth and a string of easy wins will do to you. Enough games, he roared, reaching for Iris's shoulder, presumably to yank her to her feet and make some kind of dramatic point about Kovalesh superiority. What happened next took approximately 2.7 seconds. I know because I reviewed the security footage 17 times afterward, and the timestamp doesn't lie. Iris moved. Not quickly in the way that looks fast, quickly in the way that simply erases the space between one position and another. Her bound hands came up, the restraint cord catching Drax's reaching arm at the wrist. She twisted, using his own forward momentum against him, and suddenly he was off balance. Her shoulder drove into his solar plexus, which we Kovalesh have in roughly the same place humans do, and his breath exploded out in a whoosh that was decidedly not a roar. The pain inducer he'd been holding clattered to the floor. Iris caught it before the sound of impact finished echoing. Drax tried to recover, tried to grab her with his other hand, but she'd already sidestepped. The pain inducer, still activated and crackling with energy, touched the exposed section of his neck right above his chest plate. Every nerve in Drax's body fired at once. His muscles locked. His heart, overwhelmed by the electrical chaos, stopped. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, 370 pounds of warrior hitting the durasteel floor with a sound like a gong being struck. Dead before his face made contact with the ground. Iris stepped over his corpse, walked calmly back to the chair, sat down and placed the pain inducer on the floor beside her feet. Her hands were still bound, her breathing hadn't changed. She hadn't made a single sound during the entire sequence. Not a grunt of effort, not a gasp, not a battle cry, nothing. The silence in the interrogation bay was absolute. Every Kovalesh in that room, warriors who'd faced charging Krithans and swarms of Vendurian attack drones, stood frozen in complete shock. Throck found his voice first, because commanders are trained to respond even when their brains are screaming contradictory information. Restrain her, he roared, but there was something new in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before: uncertainty. The remaining 5 guards didn't move. They were staring at Drax's body, at the human sitting calmly in the chair, at the space between those two things where their understanding of reality had just been thoroughly shattered. He got too close, Iris said quietly, like she was explaining a minor procedural error. I told him to stop. She had. She literally had. We'd all heard it. Stop. One word. One warning. That was self-defense. Iris continued in that same soft, reasonable tone. So it doesn't count toward my official tally, but I thought you should know that. For the record, I was recording everything, for the record. Official tally. Those words would haunt my audio logs for weeks. Krath, who had significantly more combat experience than Drax had possessed, moved very carefully to the side of the room where the emergency containment protocols could be activated. Energy barriers, chemical restraints, the works. His hand hovered over the control panel. I wouldn't, Iris said, not even looking at him. Krath's hand stopped moving. One body on the floor. One human in a chair. 6 Kovalesh warriors suddenly realizing they might have made a catastrophic miscalculation about what constituted a weak prisoner. Throck's roar, when it finally came, sounded forced. You dare threaten us? You dare attack a Falish warrior on our own ship? Iris looked at him with those calm brown eyes. I don't threaten, she said quietly. I inform. There's a difference. You should probably learn it quickly. Throk made the worst decision of his military career at that exact moment. Instead of backing off, reassessing the situation, maybe consulting with someone who had actual intelligence about human combat capabilities, he decided to solve the problem with overwhelming force, which is very on-brand for Kavalash leadership, honestly. Combat Team Alpha to Interrogation Bay, he bellowed into his comm unit. Subdue the prisoner. Non-lethal force authorized. 7 warriors arrived within 90 seconds, full combat gear, shock batons, neural disruptors, and enough confidence to invade a small moon. They poured through the entrance, roaring their battle cries, because of course they did. Subtlety is not exactly a Kavalash strong suit. Iris stood up from her chair, still bound at the wrists, and watched them come. The first warrior, a female named Vrix, who I'd served with for 8 cycles, charged straight at Iris with a shock baton raised high above her head, screaming a traditional war cry about crushing her enemies and hearing the lamentations of their offspring. Iris waited until Vrix was 3 steps away, then dropped into a crouch so low and so fast that Vrix's momentum carried her right over the human's head. Iris's bound hands came up, somehow looping the restraint cord around Vrix's ankle mid-leap. Momentum plus leverage plus gravity equals 1 warrior flipping face first into the durasteel floor at terminal velocity. Vrix's skull made a wet crunching sound against the metal. Body count 2. The second and third warriors, twins named Grak and Grok because our parents are not particularly creative, tried to flank her from both sides. Standard pack tactics. Iris grabbed the shock baton from Vrix's twitching hand, jammed it into Grak's throat with her bound hands, then used his convulsing body as a shield against Grok's neural disruptor blast. Grak died from electrical overload. Grok got hit by his own reflected disruptor shot and collapsed like a sack of gravel. Body count 4. Still no sound from the human, not even heavy breathing. The remaining 4 warriors hesitated, which is the first time I'd ever seen a Kavalash combat team hesitate in my entire career. That hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in combat 2 seconds is an eternity. Iris used that eternity to vault over the chair, grab the pain inducer she'd placed on the floor earlier, and throw it like a spear directly into the chest plate of the warrior closest to the door. The impact didn't kill him, but the device activated on contact, and suddenly he was seizing and screaming, blocking the exit while his nervous system ate itself from the inside out. Body count 5. Spread out. Throk roared from his position near the monitoring station, because apparently watching his warriors die was teaching him something about tactics. Do not let her control the engagement space. Too late for that. Iris was already moving, using the interrogation chair as cover, then as a weapon, kicking it with enough force that it ripped free from its floor bolts and slammed into another warrior's knees. Kavalash's knees bent backward, not forward. The warrior, whose name I think was Renth, went down howling. Iris was on him in a heartbeat, using his own combat knife to open his throat. The howling stopped. Body count 6. 2 warriors left from the combat team, plus the 5 original guards, who were supposed to be helping, but were clearly having second thoughts about getting anywhere near this situation. One of the remaining combat warriors, a grizzled veteran named Court, who'd survived the Vendurian campaign, decided to try something smart. He activated a flashbang grenade, the kind designed to overwhelm sensory input through both light and sound. Iris closed her eyes before it detonated. Just closed them, like she'd been expecting it. The grenade went off, a supernova of light and a thunderclap of sound that should have left her disoriented and helpless. She opened her eyes, located Court through the dissipating flash by sound alone apparently, and threw his own combat knife back at him. It buried itself in his eye socket up to the hilt. Body count 7. The last combat team warrior, I didn't catch his name, turned and ran for the exit. Smart. Survival instinct finally overriding battle conditioning. Iris picked up the neural disruptor from Grok's corpse, aimed without rushing, and fired. The blast caught him between the shoulder blades. He dropped mid-stride. Body count 8. Total elapsed time since combat team arrival, 43 seconds. 8 Kavalash warriors. 8 corpses. 0 sounds from the human except the soft pad of her feet on the durasteel floor and the mechanical noises of the weapons she'd appropriated. Throk stared at the carnage, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so completely horrifying. "What are you?" he finally managed. And for the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't roaring. Iris looked at him, still holding the neural disruptor, still bound at the wrists, still absolutely calm. Annoyed, she said quietly. While Throck was having what I can only describe as an existential crisis in the interrogation bay, I did what any sensible communications officer would do when confronted with a situation that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. I started researching. My claws flew across the console, accessing the galactic database, pulling up every file we had on humanity, which, embarrassingly, wasn't much. Earth had only joined the galactic community about 70 years ago, and most species, including us, had dismissed them as unremarkable. No natural weapons, no armor plating, average strength, average speed, nothing particularly impressive about their biology at all, except that assessment was clearly horrifyingly wrong. I found their military history files first. Public records. The kind any species could access if they bothered to look, which we obviously hadn't, because why would you research the species you're about to casually kidnap and intimidate? My translator struggled with some of the Earth terminology, but the visual records were clear enough. Humans had been killing each other for their entire evolutionary history, not in the Kevelesh way, with glorious roaring battles and honorable single combat. No, humans killed quietly, efficiently. They'd invented something called ambush hunting about 2 million years before they'd developed written language. They'd perfected the art of stalking prey, getting close without being detected, and striking without warning. They had dozens of words for different types of silent killing: assassination, ambush, subterfuge, guerrilla warfare, stealth operations. Each one represented thousands of years of refinement and practice. I pulled up a historical file labeled Ninja. The translation came through as Shadow Warrior, humans who'd trained their entire lives to move without sound, to kill without being seen, to turn anything and everything in their environment into a weapon. They'd considered it an art form. Another file. Snipers. Humans who could kill from distances so extreme their targets never heard the shot that ended them. Another. Special Forces. Elite human warriors who specialized in infiltration, sabotage, and silent elimination of high-value targets. They trained for years to control their breathing, their heart rate, their emotional responses, to become invisible predators in plain sight. "Oh no," I whispered, my vocal cords barely functioning because actual terror was setting in. "Oh no, oh no." I accessed the biological files next. Humans were persistence predators. That phrase kept appearing over and over. They couldn't outrun their prey over short distances, so they'd evolved to simply outlast everything else. They would track wounded animals for days, weeks if necessary, until their prey collapsed from exhaustion. They didn't need to be faster. They didn't need to be stronger. They just needed to be more patient, more determined, and more willing to keep going long after any sensible creature would have given up. And their biology supported this terrifying strategy. They could regulate their body temperature through sweating, allowing them to function in extreme heat that would kill most species. Their cardiovascular systems were absurdly efficient. Their brains had evolved specifically to predict patterns and plan multiple steps ahead. They were ambush predators wrapped in the skin of endurance hunters, with millions of years of evolutionary pressure teaching them that the quietest hunter eats the most prey. "Commander Throck." I screamed into my comm unit, abandoning all protocol because protocol didn't cover this situation. "Commander, you need to see this. Humans are not diplomats. I mean, they are, but they have their species is built for this." Static crackled back. "Vex, I am somewhat occupied at the moment," Throck roared, and I could hear weapon discharge in the background. "Sir, humans are apex predators," I shouted, pulling up more files, each one worse than the last. They evolved by hunting animals larger and more dangerous than themselves. They invented projectile weapons 30,000 years ago. They have been perfecting the art of killing quietly since before they had fire. This is not a diplomat. This is, we have captured something that her entire species has been selectively breeding for lethality for millions of years. I found one more file. Recent, from Earth's own military database, public information that we could have accessed at any time if we'd bothered. Diplomatic Corps personnel were required to complete basic combat training. Basic in human terms meant 6 months of hand-to-hand fighting, weapon proficiency, survival skills, and tactical assessment. Iris Chen had completed advanced training, 3 years. specialization in close-quarters combat and hostile environment negotiation. She wasn't just a diplomat. She was a diplomat who could kill you 7 different ways with a spoon if the negotiations went badly. "Commander," I said into the comm, my voice barely steady. "We need to evacuate the interrogation level. We need to seal it off. We need to contain this situation before..." An explosion shook the ship. Alarms started blaring. The comm filled with screaming. "Before what, Vex?" Throk's voice came back, and he sounded like a warrior who'd just watched his entire worldview crumble into dust. "Before she decides to leave," I whispered. Iris Chen walked out of the interrogation bay like she was leaving a disappointing restaurant. She'd finally broken her wrist restraints, which apparently human diplomatic corps personnel could do whenever they wanted, but chose not to because of something called Geneva Conventions that applied to proper prisoner treatment. Since 8 Kivalesh warriors were now decorating the floor in various states of dead, I guess she'd decided proper treatment was off the table. The door sealed behind her. Emergency containment protocols, activated by Krath before Iris had appropriated his shock baton and introduced it to his skull at high velocity. Body count, 9. I watched her progress through the security cameras, and what I witnessed was nothing like any combat I'd ever seen. She didn't run through corridors roaring challenges. She moved along the walls, using the shadows created by our own lighting systems. When she encountered a patrol, 3 warriors marching in formation and announcing their presence with traditional war chants, she simply waited. They walked right past her. She killed the rear guard first, snapping his neck with a twist that made no sound louder than a knuckle cracking. Lowered his body to the floor gently while the other 2 kept marching, kept chanting, completely unaware their companion was dead. The second warrior died when Iris used his own helmet strap as a garrote. The choking sounds were drowned out by the third warrior's continued war chant, right up until Iris used the second corpse's weapon to shoot him in the back of the head. Body count 12. She took their ammunition, their tools, and 1 warrior's comm unit. Then she dragged all 3 bodies into a maintenance alcove and continued moving. "All warriors, this is Commander Throk." The ship-wide announcement system blared. "The human prisoner has escaped. Secure all critical systems. Maximum alert status. Hunt her down and show her the might of the Gwalish fleet." Iris looked directly at the nearest security camera, gave a little wave, and disappeared into a ventilation shaft. Our ventilation shafts were not designed for humanoid access. They were maintenance tunnels for repair drones, narrow and dark and full of sharp edges. Iris crawled through them like she'd been born in there, following the ship's layout with an accuracy that suggested she'd memorized the blueprints during her very brief and mostly silent time in the interrogation bay. She emerged in the weapons deck, where 6 warriors were arming themselves with heavy ordnance, preparing to hunt her down. She dropped from the ceiling vent directly onto the first warrior's shoulders. The explosion killed 3 more instantly. Body count, 16. The remaining 2 warriors, both veteran soldiers who'd survived actual battles against actual enemies, fired their weapons at where Iris had been. She'd already moved, circling behind them through the smoke and chaos, using their own battle roars to mask her footsteps. 1 died when she kicked his knee backward, then used his own combat knife to finish the job while he was screaming. The other turned, saw her, opened his mouth to roar a challenge, and discovered that Iris had thrown his dead companion's knife with enough force to lodge it in his throat before any sound could emerge. Body count, 18. Engineering section was next. 4 technicians, unarmed but frantically trying to lock down the ship's critical systems to prevent exactly what Iris was clearly planning. She used the environment against them. Superheated coolant pipes, emergency blast doors, a maintenance lift that crushed 1 technician when Iris simply pressed the down button at the right moment. Body count 22. The last technician, a young female named Pira, who I'd shared meals with in the ship's canteen, held up her hands in surrender. She wasn't a warrior. She'd never wanted to be. She just fixed engines and hoped to retire peacefully someday. Iris looked at her for a long moment, then pointed to a supply closet. Pira ran into it. The door sealed behind her, locked from the outside. Iris moved on without killing her, which was somehow more terrifying than if she had. It meant she was choosing her targets. It meant she was making decisions about who needed to die and who didn't. It meant she was hunting with purpose, not rage. The command center was 3 levels up. Between Iris and her destination were approximately 40 warriors, all now fully alert, all armed, all roaring their determination to avenge their fallen comrades. She reached the bridge access corridor 15 minutes later. I counted the bodies she'd left behind through security footage. 15 more corpses. Some killed with weapons. Some killed with environmental hazards. One killed with his own severed arm, which I still don't understand the mechanics of, and frankly don't want to. Body count, 37. Wait. No, minus Pyrrha, who was still alive in that closet. Body count, 36 who stayed dead. One who Iris decided could live. Every single death accomplished in near-perfect silence. The only sounds were the impacts, the brief wet noises of bodies shutting down, and the emergency alarms that were now screaming throughout the entire ship. Iris Chen stood outside the command center doors. I could see her on the hallway security feed. She still looked calm. Her diplomatic uniform was torn and covered in blood. None of it hers. She had acquired 6 different weapons and was carrying them with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been training with firearms since childhood. She pressed the door's comm panel. "Commander Thruck," she said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through every other sound. "We need to talk." The command center doors opened because Throke was still somehow clinging to the delusion that he could win this through intimidation. He stood in the center of the bridge, chest plates fully extended, battle scars on full display, surrounded by his remaining bridge crew. 8 warriors, all armed, all positioned strategically around the room. They'd had 15 minutes to prepare for her arrival, to set up overlapping fields of fire, to plan their coordinated attack. Iris walked in alone, holding a single neural disruptor loosely in her right hand. "Welcome, human," Throck roared, and I swear his voice made the view screens vibrate. "You have fought well. You have proven yourself a worthy opponent, but this ends now. You are one, we are many. Surrender and I promise you a warrior's death. Quick and honorable." Iris looked around the command center, taking in the positions of every warrior, the layout of the consoles, the locations of the weapons, the structural weak points. Her eyes moved with the efficiency of someone doing calculations in their head. "No," she said quietly. "Just that. No. One word. One syllable. Then you die here," Thruck bellowed, raising his arm to signal the attack. Iris shot the primary power conduit behind him before his arm finished moving. The command center plunged into emergency lighting, red and dark and disorienting, especially for Kavalish eyes that had evolved for bright daylight hunting. The bridge crew roared in confusion, in anger, in fear, firing their weapons at where Iris had been standing. She'd already moved. One warrior went down with a neural disruptor blast to the spine. Another died when Iris used the darkness to get close enough to drive a combat knife up through the soft spot under his jaw. Body count, 38. Thraug activated his personal shield generator, a glowing barrier that could stop most projectile weapons. Smart. Too bad Iris wasn't using projectiles anymore. She threw a plasma charge over the shield. It landed at Throke's feet. He looked down at it, his warrior's instinct recognizing the threat, and dove for cover behind the command console. The charge didn't explode. It was a dud, or she deactivated it, or it was never armed in the first place. Psychological warfare. Make him break his defensive position. Make him move. Iris was waiting when he rolled out from behind the console. She'd somehow acquired a shock baton from one of the dead bridge crew, and she drove it into the gap between Throck's chest plates with surgical precision. His shield generator sparked and died. The baton's charge continued into his body, but Throck was a veteran of 32 campaigns. He'd survived worse. He grabbed Iris's arm, lifted her off the ground with one hand, and threw her across the command center. She hit the wall hard enough to dent the durasteel. "You are strong," Throck roared, advancing on her, "but you are still just flesh. Still just soft skin and breakable bones. I have killed hundreds of your kind in my imagination. Now I will make it reality." Iris stood up, slower this time. She was hurt. Finally, after everything. After 36 corpses and a path of destruction through an entire warship, she was actually hurt. She wiped blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, and laughed. Not a big laugh. Just a quiet chuckle that somehow carried across the entire bridge through all the alarms and the chaos and the sounds of the remaining bridge crew trying to restore power. "You've killed hundreds of me in your imagination," she said, and her voice was still quiet, still calm, still absolutely terrifying in its complete lack of fear. "I've killed 36 of you in reality. in the last 20 minutes, without breaking a sweat. Want to compare statistics? Throck charged. All 7 feet of him, 300 pounds of muscle and armor and rage, closing the distance in 3 thunderous steps. Iris waited until he was 1 step away, then dropped to the floor and swept his legs. Basic move. Every human child learns it in self-defense class, according to the files I'd read. Throck crashed face first into the wall Iris had just been leaning against. The impact cracked his chest plates. Iris was on his back before he could recover, one arm around his throat in a chokehold that cut off both air and blood flow to his brain. This is called a rear naked choke, she said conversationally, like she was teaching a class. You'll be unconscious in about 8 seconds, dead in 20 if I don't let go. Throck thrashed, tried to roar, managed only a strangled wheeze. His hands clawed at her arms, finding no purchase. 8 seconds. He stopped struggling. 20 seconds. His hands dropped. 25 seconds. Iris released him and let his body slump to the floor. Body count, 39. No, wait. She'd let go. Throck was still breathing, barely unconscious but alive. She'd spared him. Deliberately. Iris stood up, walked to the main command console and pressed a few buttons. The ship's intercom activated. Attention all Kavalish personnel, she said, her quiet voice now broadcasting through every speaker on the crushing thunder. This is Iris Chen, human diplomatic envoy. Your commander is unconscious. 39 of your crew are dead. The rest of you are going to stand down, return to your quarters and wait quietly while I contact my people. Anyone who has a problem with this plan is welcome to come to the bridge and discuss it with me in person. Silence. Nobody came to the bridge. The human fleet arrived 6 hours later. 3 ships, nothing particularly impressive by galactic military standards. Decent firepower, decent shields, nothing that would make you run screaming just from looking at them, but we ran screaming anyway. Metaphorically, Kavalish don't actually run, but we definitely filed emergency surrender documents faster than our bureaucracy had ever moved before. Iris Chen sat in the command chair the entire time, still covered in blood that wasn't hers, calmly navigating our communication protocols like she'd been operating Kavalish systems her whole life. She'd given the surviving crew members permission to retrieve their dead, to receive medical treatment, to eat and rest. She'd been unfailingly polite about it. That was somehow the worst part. When the human recovery team beamed aboard, they found Iris completing an incident report on a data pad she'd appropriated from somewhere. Professional documentation. Timestamps, casualty lists, a detailed accounting of every action she'd taken and why. The human commander, a man named Richard Okonkwo, who stood about 6 feet tall and looked disappointingly ordinary, reviewed the report while his medical team checked Iris for injuries. 37 confirmed fatalities, he read aloud, his voice normal volume, conversational, completely lacking the righteous fury we'd expected. 15 major injuries, 1 enemy vessel captured intact, 0 human casualties, 0 collateral damage to non-combatants. He looked up at Iris. You let one go. The technician in engineering. She wasn't a combatant, Iris said, accepting a bottle of water from a medic. She surrendered. I'm not a barbarian. 37 of us dead, and she was worried about being called a barbarian. Commander Okonkwo nodded like this made perfect sense. The diplomatic corps is going to have questions about this incident. I filed all the appropriate paperwork, Iris replied. They captured me in neutral space, attempted enhanced interrogation, and became hostile when I declined to cooperate. Everything I did falls under self-defense protocols and the protection of classified information. You killed 37 beings with your bare hands and whatever you could find lying around. 36, sir. Commander Throck survived. And technically I used their weapons more than my bare hands. It seemed wasteful not to. I watched this exchange from my monitoring station, where I'd remained the entire time because leaving seemed like it might attract attention, and attracting Iris Chen's attention seemed like a spectacularly poor survival strategy. The human crew began processing the Kavalish survivors for release. Medical treatment, psychological evaluation, statements for the official inquiry. They were professional, efficient, and quiet. So quiet, they moved through the ship like ghosts, speaking in normal conversational tones, never raising their voices, never needing to. One of them passed my station and nodded politely. Rough day? He asked, like we were colleagues comparing notes about bad weather. I just stared at him. The Kavalish survivors, the ones who could still function, were traumatized. Not by the violence. We understood violence. We'd been raised in it, trained in it, celebrated it. We were traumatized by the silence, by the efficiency, by the complete absence of emotion or fury or any of the things that made killing make sense to us. Iris Chen had moved through our ship like death itself, quiet and inevitable and utterly calm. She hadn't roared her victories. She hadn't celebrated her kills. She'd simply done what needed doing and moved on to the next task. 3 days later, after the diplomatic incident had been formally resolved and both sides had agreed to pretend the Kavalish had definitely not tried to kidnap a human envoy, and humanity had definitely not responded by having one small woman dismantle an entire warship's crew, I finally worked up the courage to access Iris Chen's full personnel file. Basic diplomatic training, advanced combat certification, specialist rating in hostile negotiation environments, 3 years of field experience in high-risk sectors, commendations for de-escalation, for peaceful resolution, for avoiding conflict whenever possible, preferred assignment, cultural exchange and trade negotiations. And at the bottom of her file, a note from her commanding officer. Chen excels at finding non-violent solutions and should be assigned to diplomatic missions whenever possible. However, if violence becomes unavoidable, be advised that she is fully capable of handling the situation independently. That was the word they'd used. I thought about the 37 bodies, about the way she'd moved through our ship without fear, without rage, without making a sound, about the fact that she'd been a diplomat first and had only become a weapon when we'd forced the issue. And I realized the truly terrifying thing about humanity. They hadn't sent their best warrior. They hadn't sent their most aggressive fighter or their loudest champion or their most decorated killer. They'd sent a diplomat who happened to also be all of those things because apparently every human was expected to be capable of extreme violence if circumstances required it, but preferred not to be because they'd evolved past needing to prove themselves through constant combat. We Kivalesh roared our power to the galaxy because we needed everyone to know we were strong. Humans stayed quiet because they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They knew what they were. They'd always known. They'd spent millions of years becoming the most efficient predators their planet had ever produced, and then they decided that maybe, just maybe, they could be something more than that. But the predator was still there, waiting, quiet. Iris Chen never raised her voice once during the entire incident. She didn't need to. The body count spoke for itself. Final tally, 37 Kavalesh dead. 1 human not even breathing hard, and an entire species suddenly very aware that we'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. We don't capture human diplomats anymore. We don't even raise our voices around them, just in case.